those of you who have been with us for the past couple weeks, we have had Joel Richardson, the adventurer who has gone to Mount Sinai and has come back with such incredible treasures that we wanted to break this out to the world and let Joel tell his story. But as I was alluding to this on last week's program, we were looking at doing just one more special program. But as we were sitting at dinner and going through some of these things, there are so many treasures that we just had to add another program on before the tail end of this thing because of Joel's experience and with the Yam Suf, with Israel's egress, their exodus from Egypt down to the Yam Suf, down to the Red Sea. And so we have Joel back with us to fill in some of the blanks that have been left in really the Christian tradition mainly. It's the Jews have no problem with this. The Arabs have no problem with this, but the Christians, we pretty well get our archaeology from Constantine's mother, and she's known as the greatest archaeologist who's ever lived. She found everything she wanted to find, exactly where she wanted to find it. It didn't matter how many people had to die. And so we've got Joel Richardson back with us. Joel, thank you for coming back, and tell us the rest of the story as we are now proceeding out of Egypt down to the Red Sea. Take us on that journey, if you would.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. This has been a really fun time. As we left off on last week's program, we were talking about the Yam Suf. So Yam Suf in the Hebrew, it's most often in modern English translations as Red Sea, right? Now we know in Hebrew, Yam is sea. Suf, on the other hand, has been much debated. Now essentially what happened, I'll just sort of give a little history in terms of to clear away the fog of scholarship and history and just the calcification that happens over time with these false traditions, the compounding errors of time, is essentially the Greeks, they understood the body of water south of the Arabian Peninsula, out sort of in between the Indian Ocean. They called that the Red Sea, the Arathra Thalassa. Okay, so then what happened is when the translators of the Septuagint came along, they come to the Hebrew Yam Suf, and they translated that as Erythra Thalassa, Red Sea. The problem is Suf in Hebrew does not mean red, right? So this was a bad translation. Well, then we sort of move forward in time a little bit, and Jerome comes along with his Latin Vulgate, and he translates it into Latin, again as Red Sea, as I think it's Maro Rubro or something like this, close. And then eventually this becomes in English, the Red Sea. Well, it's a bad translation. So now modern translators, they go, okay, it's not Red Sea. What should it have been? What should Suf have been translated as? And some argue that it should be reeds. Others argue that it should be the ending or the boundary. Now, I mean, I'm not a Hebrew or not a Greek scholar. I don't pretend to be, but I can read through all the scholarly, articles and the debates and so forth. And to me, it's very clear that the guys who say it means reeds, they're claiming that it's a Hebrew, it's an Egyptian loan word. That they took an Egyptian word and it's sort of been tweaked and it means reeds. The problem is you look through the abundance of the use of this word throughout the scriptures, and that just doesn't work. And so the other guys argue that Suf is simply from the Hebrew sof, which means the end or boundary. So thus what the scriptures are saying is that the Gulf of Aqaba, that the Red Sea, what we call the Red Sea, that the Bible calls it the sea of the boundary, the sea of the ending. This was the sea at the southern boundary of the Promised Land.
Let's see if that works with the rest of the evidence that we have in the scripture then.
Right, and this is the thing, is it all falls together. Yam Suf, it's used 24 times in the scriptures. Every time the Bible uses it, every single last time it's used of the body of water known as the Gulf of Aqaba. It identifies it as being right next to Edom. It identifies it as being at the southern boundary of Israel. It identifies it as being next to Eloth. That's the modern day city of Eilat. If you move it over there to the western side where the traditionalists try to put it above the Gulf of Suez, it doesn't work.
No.
Just the maps fall apart. So we were talking about that on the last program, just to sort of jump in and look at another scriptural evidence for this. In Exodus 13:17, it says that when the Israelites left Egypt, it says they didn't follow the path that went from Egypt up to the land of the Philistines. That's basically Gaza. So let's say they're following that Mediterranean coastline. And today, the roads are very similar to what they were back then, these ancient trade routes. We know where they were. It says they didn't go that way. Instead, they went through the desert to the Yam Suf. They went by the way of the desert to the Red Sea. And so I think it's always helpful to have maps. So these are the two paths that they could have taken. It says they went from Egypt over there to Yam Suf. Now, I put a green line up there. The reason I put that there is this is today, it's a body of water called Wadi al-Arish. Okay, it's again part of the Egyptian Sinai. That, according to the scriptures, is the brook of Egypt, also called the boundary of Egypt. This was the border of Egypt. Okay, so, you know, you've got some of these scholars, they say, well, back in the days of Moses, the borders of Egypt would have been way over here near Cairo. They try to move it. And they can say all that they want. They can quote Herodotus and Strabo and Pliny and all these different guys, the Greco-Roman geographers. And that's all good and fine, but what do the scriptures say? What does the Bible say? The Bible says that Wadi al-Arish is the border of Egypt. So here's the point, is then it goes on and it says that Israel came out of Egypt in martial array. They were in military formation. But the point is, by the time they got to the Red Sea, they were out of Egypt. That only gives us one option. They were not over there near these marshy bodies of water north of the Gulf of Suez. They were over there by the Gulf of Aqaba. They were out of Egypt before they even crossed the Red Sea. The only place the Bible gives us, the only option, is that the Red Sea crossing happened at the Gulf of Aqaba.
Okay, now what do we know about the Yam Suf as far as what the scriptures say? It's Solomon built his navy yard, which he really sent his ships out around the world to collect some of the delicacies of the world. It says he built his navy yard at Etzinggeber, which is next to Eilat.
Yeah.
And there is only one place for that body of water, and that's in the southern part of Israel, right there on what is now the Gulf of Aqaba.
Right. You know, and I'm going to actually quote, I pulled a quote from James Hoffmeyer. It's interesting because he actually says, you know, he argues for 35 pages in his book. Again, Hoffmeyer is like the world's leading authority, Egyptologist among the traditionalists. He says the Constantinian Sinai down there in the Sinai Peninsula, he says that's the real deal. And he says this, he acts like confused. He goes, why First Kings says that the Yam Suf is over there at the Gulf of Aqaba, we may never know. We may never know why. He says, but here's what's clear. This sole example is not enough evidence to move the sea crossing over there. He completely has flipped the biblical testimony upside down. Every single verse that talks about the Yam Suf is over there at the Gulf of Aqaba. Not a single verse moves it over to the western side of the peninsula. There's one verse that talks about the Mediterranean wind blowing the locusts out of the land of Egypt. A lot of English translations say into the Yam Suf. So what they do is they say, well, that must be, again, these bodies of water over there on the western side, but it's a bad translation. The accurate translation is out of the land of Egypt toward the Red Sea, not into the Red Sea, just so you had a Mediterranean wind, it blew the locusts out of the land of Egypt toward the Yam Suf. There is not a single verse in the Bible that allows us to move the Yam Suf anywhere other than the Gulf of Aqaba.
And that would sweep the locust out of the land of Egypt.
Exactly. So then, you know, now you just take the next logical step. If the crossing was at the Red Sea, Sinai has to be over there in Saudi Arabia. There's no other alternatives. And we know scripturally that it was in the land of Midian. Okay, so this is so critical. Now, again, it's amazing how on every one of these points, the critics, the traditionalists, they're trying to argue their way around it. So what they'll say is they'll go, biblically speaking, there is no land of Midian. The Midianites were nomadic, they were moving around. And I go, yeah, at different times in history, they pop up over here by the land of the Philistines. During the time of Gideon, they're up there in Moab. I go, that's fine, but that's a few hundred or even several hundred years after the Exodus. It says in the scriptures that Moses went and he was shepherding the sheep of Jethro in the land of Midian. scholarly consensus acknowledges that there was a principal ancient homeland of Midian. The scriptures refer to the land of Midian, and we can identify it, we can find it, we can name it, and today it correlates to that area of northwest Saudi Arabia. Specifically, there's a town that's there today. You can go there. I was just there several weeks ago. It's called Al-Bad. In Arabic, it would be like if you say bad as someone's choking you a little bit and you'll say it right, Al-Bad. I can't do the Arabic, but it's a small town. In ancient times, it was a well-known city. And that is the town that if you read through the ancient Greco-Roman geographers, they call that town specifically Midian or Madium. It was well known during Paul's day, during Josephus' day, the whole Second Temple period, the first century. They knew that today the town of Al-Bad, that was known as Midian. And so this is not a mystery. Again, the fog of scholarship has tried to obfuscate and just blur and sort of muddy this all up. And, when they don't have a good answer, they write a 35-page dissertation. And when you're done, you go, this guy seems awfully smart. But when you just cut through, the scriptures actually are very clear about this issue.
Well, it's really amazing what people will do to protect their religion and their religious tradition. Like that is the most important thing, instead of going for the truth and seeing how the scriptures fit together and tell a coherent story. They will destroy the scriptures so that they can be right, so that their traditions, their religion can be right. That's why I hate religion. I want the truth. I hate religion. And I hate what people will do to lie, to deceive other people, to try to tear the scriptures apart so they can be right. So I appreciate what you're doing. You're actually putting the story together, and you have to go back to some of these ancient languages, and you had to go back to the land.
Yeah, and once you're there, it becomes so clear. Now, I'll tell you, when I was in Al-Bad, and here's what's interesting, again, and I've mentioned this on some of the other shows, when you read the critics, when you read the traditionalists, what they try to do is a diversionary tactic. You debated David Rohl, again, a real gentleman, but in that debate, his primary effort is to put all emphasis on Ron Wyatt. Let's pick Ron Wyatt apart. Let's make it about Ron Wyatt. Well, he's not a trained archaeologist. They try to make it about these guys. Okay, I go, obviously, you don't want to deal with the historical facts. So when I got to the town of Al-Bad, again, ancient Midian, do you know what the local Muslims call it? Another name for Al-Bad is Mugher Shu'aib. Shu'aib is the Quranic name for Jethro. Mugher, again, I'm not pronouncing it great, but Mugher, it means the caves. They call the town of Al-Bad the caves of Jethro. And you can go there today. Now, these caves are similar to what you find up in Petra in southern Jordan. They have that sort of first century Nabatean style. So these were caves that were likely assumed later by the Nabatean Arabs. But this tradition goes back thousands of years that this is where Jethro lived. This is Jethro's house. This is where Moses lived. Now, whether they lived in these specific caves or not, it probably was right there. And about a kilometer away is a very well-known ancient well that the locals call the Well of Moses.
The Well of Moses. So these Arabs, they haven't been to Christian Bible schools in America. They don't have anything that they have to defend, any Christian traditions that came from Constantine's mother that have to be defended. So, these are the names that have been passed on for, literally thousands of years.
The Muslims, and this is interesting, the Muslims, including the Quran. Now, listen, as a Christian, I say the Quran has a lot of mixed up stories and different things. They've got a lot of anachronisms and historical errors. However, there are times that the Quran does preserve ideas that were common in Arabia in the 7th century, Muhammad's day. And one of these is the tradition that was passed on to them, first by Christians, that was then passed on by Jews. This ancient Jewish, Christian, and now the Muslims have preserved the tradition that this is the ancient land of Midian. I'm going to show you a picture. This is amazing. When you step out of the caves of Jethro, and there's several of them, you step out, you're there in Al-Bad. This is the picture that greets you. This is the horizon that greets you. You're looking out at the two peaks. The mountain on the left, which is slightly to the north, that would be the mountain of Horeb. Okay, then I'll call it the Triple Peaks. Actually, one of those peaks is another mountain that's actually a little closer, but it sort of all blends together. That is Mount Sinai. Okay, so Horeb is a few hundred feet taller, but the mountain just to the south is Sinai. Now, you go, well, wait a minute. I thought Horeb and Sinai. No. If you carefully analyze what the scriptures say, the entire mountain range was known as Horeb. The whole area was known as Horeb, and there was one mountain known as Horeb, but the other mountain where the fire of God came down, that's the mountain specified as Sinai. And so for 40 years, this is probably where Moses stepped out of his house and he was looking, had no idea that someday he would encounter God face to face on the top of that mountain. Right. But that's what you're looking at. And so, this is, again, when you're there, it all comes together. I enhanced that picture a little bit because it was such a hazy day, but it's beautiful to sort of get a feel for it.
From there, he could see a bush that's on fire on the side of that mountain that stays on fire. No matter how long it burns, it's not consumed.
Right.
And so he turns aside to see, what is this? And he has an encounter with the Most High, who tells him to bring my people back to this mountain and worship me here.
Yeah. It was a prelude, this fire of God, that this was no question, a mind-bending encounter, but he had no idea what was in store for him. It was a prelude to the fire that would come down from heaven, the actual manifest presence of Yehovah himself in fire and smoke and earthquakes and shakings and trumpets. I mean, just the greatest manifest self-revelation theophany of God in all of human history, right there on the top of that mountain.
As you're saying this, Joel, I again go back to that movie theater 50 years ago, and I just, I wanted to get to Mount Sinai, and over this time spending this with you, and just as you're relating this, it's like, I feel like I've finally been there, even though I have not been there, but I know that you have, that you've seen these things, you've seen the evidence, and I feel it. I feel like, okay, I finally made it.
Well, in a lot of ways, it was a journey for me, because I did go in slightly skeptical, cautious. And so for me, I was exploring, and I was, asking a lot of questions. I've got a video here that I meant to show in one of the earlier shows, but I think it's a good time to show it here. So this is a young Bedouin guy who lives right at the foot of, again, the mountain that we believe is Mount Sinai. And I asked him, I said, what do you call this mountain? Because what you hear a lot of people call it is Jabal al-Luz, the Mountain of Almonds, which is interesting, by the way, that even today it's called the Mountain of Almonds, the very place where God gave them the instructions to build the lampstand, modeled after almond branches, the place where Aaron had the rod that blossomed of almond, etc. That's a side note. But I asked him, I said, what do you call this mountain? I'm going to play this video, and it's amazing because he points at it and he calls it, this mountain, this is the mountain of Moses.
So that mountain right there, is that, you say, Jabal al-Luz?
جبل هذا موسى هذا قرنير لا سوري هذا المهرج.
So you call this one Jabal Musa?
جبل موسى.
Okay.
جبل المهرج.
So the reason that this is so important is because this young Bedouin man, this is what I want to emphasize. He hasn't been reading Ron Wyatt. He hasn't been watching the Caldwell's videos, okay? This is passed on to him from his traditions. He points at the mountain, he goes, no, that mountain, Jabal Musa. And then I asked him, I said, I thought it was called Jabal al-Luz. And he goes, no. He says, all of this whole range is Jabal Luz. All of it's Jabal Luz. He says, but that one is Jabal Musa. That's the mountain of Moses. Okay, so again, the locals believe that it's the mountain of Moses. The Saudi archaeological authorities, they believe that it's the mountain of Moses. And the reason, again, is because they have passed on these ancient Jewish, Christian, and then ultimately even Quranic traditions. And so the whole idea that this is some idea that just became popularized in the 1980s and 1990s, it's complete nonsense. That whole story needs to be done away with.
We're back in the land of Midian with Joel Richardson. Joel, tell us, how did we get the translation, the Red Sea?
Well, as we touched on in the last program, essentially in the Greco-Roman world, there was a misconception. They didn't understand. If this is interesting, if you look at the maps created the world according to Herodotus, you look at maps the world according to Strabo, they don't have two bodies of water. They don't have the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. They just have one Gulf. So they didn't even, the Greco-Roman world they were not even aware that the Sinai Peninsula existed. So if you look at their maps, you just have the Arabian Peninsula, then you have Africa, Egypt. And so they were confused. So when the translators of the Septuagint, with this sort of confused Greco-Roman geographic worldview in their head, when they started translating the Septuagint, the Hebrew Old Testament, they came to this word Yam Suf. They didn't know what to do. So it's this sea of Suf. They go, what is it? They just imported this Greco-Roman name, Arathra-Thalassa, the Red Sea, which was what they referred to as this body of water that's much further south of the Arabian Peninsula. And they imposed it into the Gulf of Aqaba. And so then that made its way into the Septuagint, eventually made its way into the Latin Vulgate. And today, this false Greco-Roman geographic misconception is we still feel the impacts of it in our modern English translations. And so this is something that needs to be put to bed a long time ago.
Yeah, man, it completely destroys the biblical narrative.
Right, and it throws everybody off. And this is a big part of the reason why the whole church has been looking in the wrong place for the mountain of God, for the Mount Sinai.
Right. And a mountain that does not in any way approximate what the biblical record states. You know, there's no way that Moses could go up on that mountain and no one would know where he's gone for 40 days and 40 nights of fasting. And what's become of Moses, this man that brought us out of Egypt? Well, all you had to do is, shout up there. He's right up there at the traditional Mount Sinai. He can't get lost up there.
Right. It's probably a lot smaller than what we'd be looking for. And it's much smaller than what Josephus and Philo and some of these Jewish commentators and historians from that period, they describe it as an exceedingly rugged and tall mountain that was really difficult to climb. And that really doesn't align with the traditional site, at all. We have solid evidence. Look, we started out, we were talking in the last segment about Midian. The Septuagint, this is really interesting. The Septuagint, when you look at the way the translators relate to the town or the city or the land of Midian, whenever they come to that word Midian in Hebrew, they translate it, interestingly, a subtle variation as Madiam. Why Madiam? Well, because in this period, there was a well-known town known as Madiam. So I've got a map here. When you go to the writings of Claudius Ptolemy, he has a work called The Geography, and he documents, coordinates of thousands of cities and spots and all over the ancient world. And here's a map that someone has recreated based on the works of Claudius Ptolemy. He lived shortly just after Paul. But as you can see here, he has two cities really right next to each other. One is called Madiam, Madiama. The other one is called Modiana. Okay, he got confused because of the variation between Midian and Madiam. But he places these two cities right next to each other. Where are they? They're over there in northwest Saudi Arabia. So the point is that translators of the Septuagint, when they saw Midian, they go, oh, this must be Madiam. Everybody knows where Madiam is. It correlates today to the town of Al-Bad, again, which is 12 miles from Jebel al-Lawz. All right, it all falls into place. Second, the translators of the Septuagint, when they came to the term for the elders of Midian, they used this specific phrase, which in the Greek always means the city councilors. The city councilors. When Jethro goes to visit Moses at the mountain of God, it says Jethro went out. So it uses the language of him leaving the city. They always use references that make us understand that they thought Midian was a city. Why? Because there was a well-known city in their day known as Madiam. So we begin with that. Is that in Paul's day, this was well known among the Jews. Now again, the translators of the Septuagint, they were over there in Alexandria. So after the Septuagint, then you have Philo. Philo was a Hellenized Jewish philosopher and commentator. So he gave commentary on the Old Testament, and he made a very specific reference, and this is critical in this whole discussion. You'll never see Gordon Franz, you'll never see David Rohl discuss these traditions, because these are devastating to their claim that this is all about these 1980s, biblical adventurers. No, these are ancient Jewish traditions. Philo specifically said that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain outside of Midian, right outside of Midian. That's a pretty specific description.
And it is literally, as you say, 12 miles outside.
Yeah. And we looked at the last segment. We said when you're in El-Bad, you step out of the caves of Jethro and you're looking right at those mountains. You're looking, there they are.
Yeah.
It dominates the horizon. So then Josephus comes along. Josephus, again, he wrote shortly after Paul, 1st century. Now, he's a Jerusalemite. He doesn't live over there in Alexandria. So now, because scholars will say, well, maybe there was a Jerusalem tradition, maybe there was an Alexandrian tradition, maybe, they didn't always meet. But the point is, now we have a second testimony from someone who lived in Jerusalem. And Josephus writes quite a lot about Mount Sinai. He writes a lot about the Red Sea, the mountains around the sea crossing. Everything lines up with the Gulf of Aqaba.
Right.
But he also, he validates Philo's statement, and he says that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain in that district, in that area of Midian, again, just outside of the town of El-Bad. So if we trust at all the testimony of Philo and Josephus in the Septuagint, we only have one option. The tallest mountain in that whole area, the tallest mountains, it's Horeb and Sinai. It's Jabal al-Lawz, Jabal al-Maqla, as they're commonly called. These are our only options. So either there was a very false tradition among the Jews during the 1st century, or they still knew, even after the exile, after the Babylonian exile, they still knew where it was. And we have enough historical hints to look at it and say, absolutely, the most reasonable guess, the most reasonable option of all of our candidates is in fact Jabal al-Lawz. And again, for clarity, the Bible only gives us one option. It has to be east of the Red Sea. So everything comes together. It's all pointing in the same spot. It's all pointing to the same mountain.
And what's the evidence of Paul? He's referring to this in the book of Galatians. We have him going down to Arabia.
Yeah, and this is huge. I want to really dig into this. I'm even thinking in the next segment, the next show, we're going to do this bonus show.
Yeah, we've got to, because there's no way that we can cover it all in this. So.
Yeah. I really want to mine this, but I'll say this. There's only 2 references in the New Testament to Arabia. They're both in Galatians. And there is very strong evidence that Paul himself, after he met Yeshua on the road to Damascus, knocked him on his duff, turned his theological world upside down, there's very strong evidence that he went to Mount Sinai. That Paul, like Elijah, he went to Mount Sinai, and that is where the Lord revealed the fullness of Paul's gospel, that he would go preach all over the world, that is where he received it by revelation. And all evidence points to the fact that Paul, as a thoroughly biblically literate Jew, a devout Jew, his identity would have been formed by the fact that he was a Jew, that he would have agreed with this Jewish tradition that was espoused by Josephus, that was espoused by Philo, that was understood and recognized by the translators of the Septuagint. We have no reason to suspect that he would have believed anything else. So we know where Paul would have believed it was.
The prized student of Gamaliel, having memorized the Torah, as he said, he was more zealous for the Torah than any of his peers. This is the man that was chosen by Yeshua to take the gospel of the kingdom to the Gentiles, because he understood the gospel of the kingdom. Because, he had the schoolmaster. He had the schoolmaster down, and now he can relate it to the Gentiles. And, we of course have stripped Paul from his Jewish context completely in the Christian world. Right. We try to remake him. We try to twist his words. This is what's done consciously, and so there's something that we can't twist, and that's what he says about Mount Sinai.
Right. And this is what the traditionalists do is they'll quote, again, Herodotus and Strabo and so forth, and they'll say, well, Paul clearly would have, his understanding of geography would have been entirely determined by the writings of the Greco-Roman geographers. And I go, no, his worldview would have been determined by the Bible. His worldview would have been determined by the Jewish traditions of his day. And then lastly, they would have been determined by Greco-Roman designations. And even that requires some unpacking. So I've got a map up here. I want to show you something here because I thought this was interesting. And as Americans, we always need maps. You know, we always get confused. But so here's a satellite image. So here you've got the Sinai Peninsula. I've put a triangle down there. That's the traditional site that the traditionalists say is Mount Sinai. Over here to the right is, in the east, is Midian. That's Jabal al-Lawz. Now, we know that Moses was shepherding Jethro's flocks in the land of Midian. Now, the scriptures say that he went to the far side of the desert and he came to the mountain of God. Now, I was reading David Roll's book, his book Exodus, and in the back he says, well, Moses actually shepherded the flocks all the way from the land of Midian, and he went all the way over there to the traditional site of Mount Sinai. And when I did the measurements, this is roughly a 450 to 500 mile round trip. Okay, you've got about 100 miles from Midian, which by the way was an oasis town with a lot of water. You've got about 100 miles before you get to the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, Eilat. That's 100 miles of desert. Then you've got to work your way down here through the mountains. This is a 500-mile round trip. Roll fudges the numbers, and he removes 150 miles round trip. And so he pulls off, he says, well, it would have been, his total is about 200 some odd miles. And he says, well, that would have been no big deal. That would have been no big deal for Moses because, he says, you shepherd your sheep where there's herbage and so forth. You go where you need to go. If you understand the topography of the area, there's no reason why he would have gone 500 miles to the southern Sinai to get food for his sheep because he lived right there in an oasis. 10 miles, 20 miles away is the town of Magda. That's an incredible oasis right toward the Red Sea. He could have gone south to some other oasis. There is no reason for him to have gone 500 miles. And then later Jethro leaves the land of Midian and he takes Moses' wife Zipporah and his children and he goes and he visits Moses. If we believe the traditional site of Mount Sinai, then we're to believe that Jethro, in his old age, would just make a 500-mile round trip through 100-mile scorching deserts, through the land of all these foreign kingdoms of the Edomites and the Amalekites. No problem. 500 miles, no, that does not make sense. Yeah. So the traditional story doesn't make sense. If we stick with Jabal al-Lawz, then the story completely, everything falls into place and it makes complete sense.
David Roll and I debated this, the Great Exodus debate, and I recognize that David Roll really was a great asset in the Patterns of Evidence movie and his deciphering of the Egyptian hieroglyphs and all, and he solved the major problem, but he hadn't seen the evidence of the real Mount Sinai, and that's why I flew him down to meet with Jim and Penny because I felt like he deserved to have the best evidence put before him, and so we spent a couple days with Jim and Penny, as you just did a short while ago, and seeing the evidence, then things shifted for him. So his book came out before then. I respect David what he's done, but a lot of people want to try to, and this is what he did in the debate. He tried to tear apart Ron Wyatt, and this debate wasn't about Ron Wyatt. It's about the evidence, about the trail of the Exodus, and where the traditionalists have built their monuments, and it's basically the Roman Catholic Church built their monuments to say this is Mara and this was Elim and all. They're all in the wrong order. It makes no sense at all. But they had to find these things and build a monument there so that they've got a place to to go to their Mecca of Mount Sinai in Arabia, in the Sinai Peninsula. But it doesn't, none of the evidence lines up. And then again, after Jim and Penny were able to get these artifacts and photographs and all, as you have done, you're just bringing more and more to the table to tell us this great story, this biblical story. And it's like, okay, we can put to bed our religion, our denominations. We can put it to bed. Let's go back to the biblical record.
Right. Look, tradition, I love the movie Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. In its pure form, it's intended to pass on truth from one generation to the next, and it can serve as a good thing. It's important. Some traditions are good. But when you start out with a false traditions tend to compound. And, I've written a book on this, and I have a whole chapter where I appeal to the scholarly community, because much of the discussion over this Jabal al-Lawz, it's been very personal. It's been attacking people. And I say, guys, first of all, this is below the quality of what scholarship should be about. And secondly, the people who are searching for truth deserve better. And third, the mountain's too important. The mountain's too important to let personal conflicts get in the way.
Yeah.
This is a treasure for the world. And we need to, its mere potential demands that we treat it with more dignity than the way that it's been handled, I'd say, the past 20, 30 years.
Yeah. So, take us, continue on with our trip into Midian.
Okay, well, so actually I'll give you a little bit of a prelude, because, I think what we said is in the next show we're going to get into...
Oh, that's right. We've only got a few minutes. Time is flying by, and we've got a lot to cover next period.
Yeah, so in the next show I think we're going to discuss, okay, the traditional site. If this is not the real Mount Sinai, then how did it become the real or how did it be called the real Mount Sinai? And so I've drilled down, I've worked through all of the historical documents, and I think when we compare the evidence for Jabal al-Lawz with the evidence of the traditional site, we'll see that, in terms of what, on the scales, what the traditional site, it's the emperor wears no clothes. There's nothing.
So this is going to be the real Exodus debate. I mean, we're going to deal with the facts on the ground and the faux Mount Sinai, how it became that, and compare it with the real evidence that we have.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, and I don't mean to be derogatory, but it's a tourist attraction. That's all it really is. Now, it's a great place of history. It has a great history in the Christian church in terms of preserving historical documents. We need to acknowledge that. And it's got an interesting history. But in terms of its legitimacy as the real Mount Sinai, it's nothing more than a tourist attraction. And as you said, there's plenty of those in the land of Israel. There's plenty of legitimate sites, but there's plenty of places that have been created as tourist attractions, and the traditional site is nothing more than that. And so, what's interesting about this, again, it's, the thing to say the traditional site is a tourist attraction. As we'll see, there are ancient traditions with regard to the traditional site, but they are well over 600 years in more modern times compared to the Septuagint. Okay, so eventually these traditions develop, but it's much, much later. But here's what's interesting is, even though there was, I'll say, this traditionalist or this Roman Empire was sort of putting their stamp of approval over here on the traditional side, at the same time, a lot of the early Christian writers, they didn't agree with that. This is important because, as we touched on, we had this ancient Jewish tradition that placed Mount Sinai over there in Midian, modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia. And then we have, beyond Paul, of course, in the post-apostolic period, we have Bishop Demetrius, and we read about what he believed in the writings of Eusebius. But Bishop Demetrius, he placed Mount Sinai over there in the land of Midian, northwest Saudi Arabia. Origen, not my favorite theologian by any means, but he's a very important witness. He placed Mount Sinai over there in Midian, northwest Saudi Arabia, as did Eusebius.
Well, we're going to have to continue on with this because we're going to dig deeper into this, ladies and gentlemen. This is all the time that we have on the air. But again, we're going to come back and we're going to explore this in detail for those of you who want to get into the meat of this. And we're going to get into the real Exodus debate as we continue on with this. So Shabbat Shalom to our fans. Shavua Tov. Have a good week, and we'll see you back here next week for Shabbat Night Live, and I would like to close in prayer. Yivarechecha Yehovah vayishmeraka. Yair Yehovah panav vichunaka. Yisa Yehovah panav v'yasem lecha shalom. B'shem Yeshua HaMashiach Zar Shalom. Amen and amen.